Hello guys, Jeffrey once again. I know, surprising. Didn't think it would be me this time, did you? Yeah, it's me again. In this tutorial I'm going to go over looping in Java, which is once again reliant on boolean expressions and once again not too difficult. All looping allows you to do really is to repeat a given series of code statements until a certain, as long as a certain value is boolean expression is true. As soon as that isn't true, it'll stop looping. So there are two basic types of loops, and in fact, really only two types of loops in Java. There's while type loops and there's for loops. The two most common forms I'm going to show you here, and I'll show you the other ones afterwards. But for while, all it's taking is it takes a boolean expression and continues to run so long as that expression is true. Note that if I just, instead of saying a is less than 3, if I put true here, this will never stop running. It's called an infinite loop. And you want to avoid those because they're incredibly inefficient. And they literally stop your program functioning right at that point. So avoid that as much as possible. But what a while loop does is, what you typically do is you'll have an integer value declared outside of it, and inside that while loop, you will be increasing or decreasing that value so that eventually the condition, such as in this case a is less than 3, so that eventually that condition won't be true anymore and it will stop functioning. A while loop always has to tend towards a boolean expression that is false. If it doesn't, you get an infinite loop. And anything inside the brackets is executed in each iteration of the loop. That's all it is. For a for loop, it's essentially a condensed while loop. You'll use these when you know exactly how many times you want something to function. While is more common if you're reading data from a file, because you don't always know if there's a next line. So you'll say, hey, while there's a next line, do this. A for loop is something you do when you have something of definite size. If for some reason you happen to know a file had exactly 100 lines, you could use a for loop and say, for I equals 0, I is less than 100, I plus plus, and it would run over that for all those lines. But typically that's not going to be the case when you're doing work with files or work with anything whose length could vary. So you typically don't use a for loop in that scenario. A for loop is used when you know how many times you want to execute a piece of code. So in this case, I want to execute this exactly 3 times. I'm saying for I equals 0, this is called the initializer. You're initializing this variable. You've got a boolean expression that determines when the for loop can run. And then you've got a change in this integer right here that will bring the for loop closer to completion. Note that if I put I minus minus here, that's going to decrease the value of I, and this will be an infinite loop also. Infinite loops are not as common with for, but they're still possible, so just be aware of those as well. And just like before, this is just going to print out whatever's inside the brackets. Note that both of these loops are exactly the same. However, the only reason they're the same is because this a plus plus in the while loop is at the end. If I move that to the beginning, you have a different loop. So, for example, right now in the terminal, I've got the output for running this when this a plus plus was at the end. And you can see it outputted the same. If I run this again right now, it's different. Now it's incrementing the value of a and then printing it, which means that these two loops now are fundamentally different. So just be aware that a for loop, this incrementation step, always occurs after the entire body of code inside the brackets has been executed. If you know that, that's really all you need to know in terms of comparing for and while. And these are the only types of loops you'll see on the AP test. However, just to be aware, it's useful to know there are 2 other types of loops. One of them is the do while loop. And a do while loop will execute these statements once first, and then any additional executions are dependent on the boolean expression. So even if I give a value of 500, this do while loop is still going to print out once. And note that too, a do while loop can be written to be identical to a for loop. In this case right here, we'll have identical output once more. Just note the only difference between do while and while is that do while always functions at least once, while may function once or it may never function. The other loop, I actually realized this actually, I believe, might be on the AP. It is on the AP test. It's a for each loop. The way you write this, and this is more when you get into arrays, it's a way of accessing every element inside a collection of elements. I don't want to get too much into the syntax of that right now because we haven't gone over arrays, but basically a for each loop is an abstraction of the regular for loop that makes it easier to handle things such as arrays. And we'll get to that later, but that's probably not the right place to go in this lesson. So I'll leave that here. That's really all you need to know for looping. Just understand these, and oh yeah, understand you can put a for loop inside a for loop. You can put 50 for loops in a for loop. You can put 50 for loops in 50 other for loops in 50 other for loops. You can do whatever you want. Just be aware you can nest stuff, and the AP test loves to have double nested for loops, so just watch out for those. And yeah, that's it. So yeah, goodbye.